In this video, I'm going to introduce you to formr, which is a simple but pretty flexible tool for building online experiments or surveys. So let's get into it. Alright, so we're going to start here with the documentation page for formr, and there's a lot of useful information on this page, but we are going to start here with the item types tab, and what this page will show you is all the different types of questions that you can include on a survey or a experiment. And there's an example spreadsheet that you can click on here. Actually, let's open that up as a new tab. And you'll see if you read this documentation, they recommend that if you make your own experiment, you could just clone this spreadsheet, and that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. So in the spreadsheet, this is how you make a brand new experiment. You design it in this spreadsheet and you load it into a survey in formr. So we're going to design our own experiment in our own spreadsheet. So this is the example they give you that shows you what all the different question types are. And if you like, you can see what that example spreadsheet would look like, what all the different question types look like in an actual survey. So you can open this up in this sample experiment and try out all those different question types to see how they would look in an actual survey. So let's make our own. We're going to make an experiment here. And let's have a look at what this spreadsheet includes. There's a whole bunch of columns here. Each row represents one question in the survey. So this one, for example, is a multiple choice question. Each of the columns here is for one property of that question. And there's some explanation already in this sample spreadsheet that tells you what this is. So for instance, this first column, explanations, this is something that formr just disregards. This is for notes you can make for yourself to help you remember what these different questions are. Class, this allows you to style the different questions in various ways. So if we go back to the documentation page and click on the survey spreadsheet tab and scroll down a bit, this gives you examples of the different classes available. But the main ones we're going to focus on here are type. So type specifies the type of question, and we'll look at a few in this example. Name, this one's required. So name is a unique name for the question, and this is important because this is going to show up later in the results that you download. So you want to pick a name that you can remember and recognize later when you look at your results. Label, this is what's going to appear to subjects or users when they actually do your survey. And then these choice columns, these are, These choice columns here are going to specify what the different options are, say for multiple choice questions, for example. All right, so let's modify this and turn this into our own experiment. So I'm going to delete most of the contents of this sample spreadsheet. So I'm going to select all of these rows and delete them except for this first one. All right, so you'll see that this first row, this first question is of type note. So note is just displaying some text, for example. And I'm going to rename this to welcome note. So this is just going to be a note that welcomes people to the experiment. So you'll notice in the label part here, there's a lot of weird syntax, and that's because formr lets you use something called first markdown, and I will put a link to a reference resource that you can look up to learn the details of markdown, which is really pretty simple. It's just a way to format text. You can also use R code if you want to, and that's what allowed, in that example you saw, to display a plot, and that's what you're seeing right here. But I'm just going to use some simple markdown. So I'm going to write hello, so that hashtag sign or that pound sign, that's a markdown styling symbol that just specifies that I want to make this a header. Then I'll write welcome to my experiment. Okay, so let's add in some other questions as well. So let's add in a multiple choice question that's type MC. And the question here will just be, how many pets do you have? And this time we're going to need to specify the choices, or the choice options. So let's do 0, 1, 2, 3, or more than 3. And remember, we also have to give this a name, so we will call this pets MC. Let's add a free choice question, or a free input question, but we're going to require people to put in a number. So there is a type for this. We go in the item types documentation. Here it is, single input family, number, right here. This requires numbers, and there's a syntax for it, number, min, max, step. So let's do, we're going to ask people what their age is. So let's say we're limiting people to over 18, so minimum 18. Let's say go to 100, and a step size of 1. So this is the age question, that's our name, and then we'll ask people what is your age? And so they'll type it in, but it has to be an integer, and it's going to be limited to be between 18 and 100 years old. Okay? Now let's add a slider type question, and one type of slider is something called type range ticks. So this will give us a range of options with a bunch of tick labels, and this has its own kind of syntax. So we'll put 0, 100, 1. So what this means is that this will range from 0 to 100 in increments of 1. And question we'll ask here is, how much do you like surfing? And we'll call this the surfing rating question. And we can also specify labels for the ends of that range. So the lower end will say not at all, and the high end will say very much. Okay, so this is a good start to our experiment. Now let's actually load it in to formr. So you're going to have to make an account, a formr account, and once you do, you can go into the admin section, and it looks like this. And we're going to start by creating a survey. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll give it a name. We'll just give it the same name, my experiment, and we have to give it a link to the Google Sheet that has all the questions, the one we just created. So to do that, we have to share the Google Sheet, and we want to make sure that people can view, anyone with the link can view. We'll copy the link, and we will go in here to share it, import, and here are a bunch of warnings, and you will probably want to have a look at this because it might have some information that points to some problems in your spreadsheet. In this case, these are not some issues. So these are things that we don't actually care about. So some of the things here, like these many choices were not used, I think it's probably referring to the fact that there's a choices. Yeah, so there's a choices sheet here that's only relevant for certain question types that we didn't actually make use of. We could actually delete that if we wanted to. And there are some rows here. Yeah, so there's a bunch of empty rows that it's just sort of alerting us to, and that's fine. So there's really no issues here. If there were any actual syntax errors or problems, there would be an actual error, and you could fix those then. Okay, so it looks like it's fine. Now we can test it out. So there are some buttons over here, testing and management. This will allow us to test out our survey. So let's have a look and see how it works. Okay, so here we have our introduction text. Hello, welcome to the experiment. How many pets do you have? We can try that out. What's your age? If I put in a letter, we can type it out, but you can see if I try to continue, it's not going to let me do that. I have to put in a number, and I can try to use these little up and down arrows, and they start at 18 because that's the lowest number. And here's our slider. Goes from 50 to 100, as you can see. Okay, so this is working the way we expected. Great. So that was pretty simple, but if we had more questions, or even if this was all the questions we had, we might want to present this on multiple pages. For example, this was a very simple introduction text, but we might want to have, if this were a real survey or a real experiment, we would probably want to have more instructions than just hello and welcome. And it might make sense to present that on a separate screen before they started the experiment. So let's do that, and we can do that. So the way to do that is there is a type called a submit. It's just a submit button, and we'll call this submit welcome. These have to be unique names, so if we're going to have multiple submit buttons, we can't just name them all submit. And we'll just call the text of the submit button will be continue. All right. Also, you saw that there was a default button at the bottom of the page, and I think it said just go on to the next page or something. I forget exactly what it said, but I didn't really like that. It was a little wordy. So let's add our own final submit button at the bottom of the final page. We'll call this submit finish. And we'll have that say continue as well. One last thing we'll do here, because I want to highlight another feature, is this optional column. So you might want to have some questions that are not required to submit. So the way to do that is you add an asterisk to that optional column. So let's do that for the pets question. So now someone submitting the questionnaire doesn't have to answer that question. They won't be prompted to answer that before they submit to go on to the next page. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this out once again. So let's go back to our survey. In the configuration part here, there's import items. Go back to import. It already has the link to the survey or the spreadsheet loaded in here. So all we have to do is re-upload. And we got no errors, so we're fine. It re-uploaded. We can go ahead and test again. Okay, so now we have the text on the initial screen. Our continue button, this will take us to the second page. Very good. All right, so let's just try continuing without answering any questions. All right, so it's going to prompt us to answer the second question. Okay, so let's put in an answer to the second question. We'll try to continue again. All right, so it did let us continue that time, and that's because for the slider question, the slider has a default answer in it, which is 50 by default, but it let us finish even though we didn't answer the first question about the number of pets. So another thing that is very useful to do for questionnaires experiments is randomizing the order that the questions appear in. And this is something that formr makes it very easy to do. So we'll start by adding 2 new columns here. And those are named block order and item order. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to randomize things in an experiment. But first, let's add a few more questions so that we can really see the effects of the randomization. So I'm going to add a few more multiple choice questions. So let's add 3 more multiple choice questions. So let's make the first one, how many TVs are in your home? And I think the answer options here, we can keep the same. Those are reasonable answer options. So we'll call this TVMC. How many siblings do you have? Again, the answer options I think are reasonable. And how many movies did you watch last month? Again, the answer options work for this question as well. So what we're first going to do is we're going to set this up so that all of the questions are in a random order. And we do that using the item order column. So the way this works is any questions that are assigned the same number in the item order column are presented in a randomized order. Any items that have a different item order are presented in the order of that number. So let me illustrate. So we're going to give 1 to note, 2 to submit. So these 2 items will appear in order. And then we will give 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 to all of the rest of these items except for the submit. So what does that mean? What effect should this have? It means that all the items, all of the questions with item order 3 should appear in a randomized order. But items 1 and 2 should always appear in that order before 3, and item 4 should always appear after items with item order 3. So let's go ahead and test that out. So let's import again. And we will test this out. Okay, so we see our initial instruction screen, our hello screen. And this already appears to be randomized because we, in our spreadsheet, we had these multiple choice questions all in a row, but they are not in a row. And let's just, let's try this again and see if we see them in a different order this time. Okay, clearly they are in a different order. So that's how you can randomize just the questions themselves. But what if you want a more complex randomization scheme? That's what the block order column is for. So what we're going to do now is we're going to present these questions as 2 randomized blocks. So what do we mean by that? We're going to present all of the multiple choice questions together So we're going to assign them all to the same block, block A, and the other two questions we're going to assign to block B. And then within each block, we're going to assign the questions the same number. So what does this mean? This means, first of all, that the blocks are going to be randomized. So block A and block B are going to be presented in a randomized order. And then within each block, say block A, you'll have the same randomization that of items using the same scheme of item order that I explained earlier. So I could do this 1, 2, 3, 4, and that would mean that within block A, these multiple choice questions would appear in the order that they appear in the spreadsheet, or we're going to do what I just had before. We could assign them all ones, and that means within block A, they will appear in a randomized order. So every time this gets loaded, these multiple choice questions will appear in a random order. So now we're going to see the multiple choice questions all appear grouped together in a randomized order, and we'll see the other two questions grouped together in a randomized order. Let's assign this 3. Okay, so we should see this looking basically the same as before, but the multiple choice questions will always be grouped together. So let's test this out. First we will import, and let's test. Okay, so this looks right so far. We've got our two non-multiple choice questions grouped together. We've got age first, and then we've got multiple choice questions with pets first. Let's try it again to see if we get the randomization we expect. All right, so this time we got multiple choice questions second with TVs first. All right, I didn't look at all the questions, but TV is still first and multiple choice questions second. It's random, so that's possible. All right, so now we've got multiple choice questions first. TV is still first. Now we got non-multiple choice questions second and age second. So this does appear to be doing what we expect. Let's just try this one more time. All right, and now we got movies first as the first multiple choice question. So clearly this is working the way that we expect. Actually, let me run this one more time because I want to run it through completely once. Okay. Let's look at the results. So we can go into show results here. That's this button here. And this will show us all of the runs of this survey, including the incomplete ones. You can see all of these tests that I ran, when they were run, and if they ended. In fact, most of these were not ended because I ended them early. But this is the one I most recently completed. And this will allow you to see all of my answers for all of the questions. And you can see here why it's so important to give your questions meaningful names, because if these names are not meaningful, if it's just like question 1, question 2, question 3, it will be very difficult to interpret these results. We can also filter these results by complete, and so now we have far fewer results. So now it's much easier to see the ones that are actually meaningful. And additionally, what you will want to do at some point is export these results for more analysis. So you click the export option, gives you a lot of export button, it gives you a lot of options. Let's do the XLSX option, the Excel option. It's going to give you the same information, but now it's in a file that you can then process with your data analysis software. So let me make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. Okay, so this includes the incomplete runs. This, of course, is the one that I most recently did. We have when it started, when it ended, and the results for all of the variables. Let me show you one additional form of data. If you click this detailed results button, this gives you some additional data, some additional variables, and let's go ahead and export that as well. So let's make this bigger as well. Okay. So one thing this will potentially be useful for is if you want response time information. So let's go down to the bottom again. This is the run that I most recently completed. Down here, these ones here. And this column has when each question was shown here in this column and when it was answered. And it has actual timestamps, but also has these columns here, shown relative and answered relative. And these are in milliseconds, units of milliseconds. So if you wanted to actually record how long it took people to respond to a question, all you have to compute is answered relative minus shown relative. So this one, the PET's multiple choice. 1977 milliseconds minus 554 milliseconds will get you an estimate for how long it took me to answer that question after it appeared to me on the screen. These are not going to be perfect estimates, but they're going to be pretty close. Okay, so now that we've built a survey, we need to put it into what formr calls a run so that people can actually access it and complete the experiment. So let's go ahead and do that now. So here we are back in the admin page. We go up here to runs. We can create a new run. And we have to give it a name first of all. So let's call it Alan's experiment. And we'll create the run. Okay, so this is what the create run screen looks like. And basically it's like a little flowchart. You make a flowchart that shows you what the experience of completing the experiment is going to look like. And the experiment consists of a bunch of little modules that are shown here. And on the right side of the page, you can get explanations of what each of these modules does. So we're going to use a few of them, and I will explain what the ones we use do and how to use them. But if you want to learn more or learn what the other modules do, you can just quickly read about them on this page. So the first most obvious one we need is a survey. We have to add our survey to this page. So let's do it. We'll add my experiment here. And this part here, description, this is not necessary, but just like that first column in the spreadsheet, this explanations thing, it's useful to add, especially if you have a detailed run, it's useful to add a description of each module to help you keep track of what you're doing. So we'll call this experiment survey. The number right here will become clear later. This indicates the order in which the modules appear. All right, so we'll go ahead and save this. Let's go ahead and test this out right now. We can do that by pressing the test run. And we see that it's working so far. We can continue. Let's go ahead and answer our questions. Oh, it's going to alert us. We need to answer this one. That's not an optional question. Okay, we got an error. It says that the study's creator forgot to give it a proper ending. All right, so this is one required module in addition to the survey. It's a stop point. We have to add a stop point to indicate that the run is done. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll call this finish. We have to add some feedback text. So thanks for completing my experiment. I think I spelled all those words right. Okay. You might also have noticed, I got out of there quickly, there was a little footer at the bottom of the page. Let's go ahead and modify that as well. So I clicked here on the settings in the configuration part, and here is that footer. So we can change a lot of things, but here is where that footer appears. We could change that to whatever we want. It suggests adding contact information. I'm going to just go ahead and delete this completely. If you were doing an experiment, you could add your contact information just on the first page of the experiment, and so this may not be necessary. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that footer text. While we're in here, I might as well point out the other things you can change. So let me save this first. There's a tab here for CSS. So this allows you to modify the appearance of the run from the default settings. So if you know how to do that, this is a place you could do it. There's also a place to add JavaScript. So if you want to add more complex functionality to your experiment, you can add it here. And there's a few other options as well that you can read about, but these are two of the most useful settings. So far we've only used text and different question types, but you might want to be able to show people pictures or something visual to either make your experiment more interesting or just give people something to respond to that they can look at. So the way to do that is to add the images as files in your run, and then you can reference them in the experiment. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to add a picture here of Cora the cat, and we'll upload that. Okay, so it has some instructions here about how to then reference those images in your survey, specifically in the spreadsheet, using markdown syntax, which is just explained right here. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So first we need to copy the URL, so we'll do that. We've copied the URL, and then we're going to use this syntax to add another question to our survey. First, what we're going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this experiment. We're going to make a new survey. I'm going to call this My Experiment 2. All right, I'm going to delete these block and item order columns. So I'm going to remove the randomization, and I'm going to delete all of the questions in here except for one. And I'm going to change this to a cat rating question. How cute is this cat? So we're going to add the picture of the cat in here using that syntax, and I'll remind you, including myself, what that syntax was. So right, here's the syntax, exclamation point, description in brackets, and then the image link. So it's a cat, and then we'll paste in the description. And then we can still use the same scale on a scale from 0 to 100, not at all to very much. This looks perfect. All right, let's go back. I want to make a brand new survey using this new spreadsheet. We'll call this My Experiment 2. So once again, we need to share this link. No errors. Let's test it out. Very good. All right. And Cora is, of course, the cutest cat, so we'll give her the highest rating. Excellent. So let's go back to our run. And now I want to illustrate how to add multiple conditions to an experiment. So now we have 2 surveys. What if we want to set up a situation where we have 2 conditions of an experiment, like we have here? We have 2 different surveys that present different sets of questions. What if we want 2 different groups to see 2 different things in our experiment? How can we do that in formr? It's pretty easy, and there's actually 2 different ways you could do it. So the first way is perhaps the simplest, is we could just set up a brand new run, repeating what we did before, and for the second run, we could point to my experiment 2, and when we run our experiment, we get half of the people, we could point them to this first run, half the people we could point them to this second run that points to my experiment 2, and we could just randomly assign them to one run or the other. We could just do this outside of formr, essentially. But there is a way to do this within formr, to do the randomization within the run itself, and that's what I'm going to illustrate for you right now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add a shuffle module. So what this does is it randomly assigns people to different groups. By default, 2. If you had more conditions, you could increase that to more groups. Let's name this random assignment. And let's also add our survey, our second survey, my experiment 2, and let's add some better descriptions of our surveys now as well. So let's call this condition 2 survey and rename our first one condition 1 survey. And let's remember to save both of these. Okay, so at this point, we're going to need to reorder things a little bit, because remember, this flow chart is presented in the order in which things appear, and this order isn't correct because we want to assign people to groups before they've done anything. So the random assignment needs to come first. So we can edit these numbers, and remember, the numbers determine the order in which the things appear. So let's set random assignment to 10, and let's set condition 2 survey to 11. Let's go ahead and reorder that. Oh, we also need to make sure that finish comes last. So let's set condition 2 survey to 30 and finish to 40. Okay, this still isn't quite right though, because what's missing is all we've done is assign people to groups, but we haven't done anything with those group assignments. Right now, this is just going to proceed from one module to the next. What we need is one of these skips. We need a skip forward or a jump. So let's add the jump right after the skip. So we actually have to need to number this once again. So jump to condition 2. And what's the condition for jumping? So I believe this explains in the random assignment here. It says you can later read the assigned group using shuffle $group. So if shuffle $group equals 2, then we'll skip forward to what? We want to jump ahead to the condition 2 survey. We'll jump to 30. Okay? We want this to come after the random assignment. So we'll set this to 11, and we'll set condition 2 survey to 12, I guess. The exact numbers here don't really mean anything, just so long as they're in the correct order. Okay, so let's think this through. Does this make sense? So we're going to assign them to 2 groups. If they're in group 2, they'll jump ahead to condition 2 survey. So far, so good. And then they'll finish. Okay. If they're not in group 2, then they won't jump ahead. Oh, I misnamed these. This is condition 1 survey. This is why the names are so important. Okay, if they're not in group 2, then they'll continue to the next module, condition 1 survey, they'll complete it. And then what? Well, then they'll just continue on to the next module. So we need another jump so that once they're done with condition 1 survey, they'll jump ahead to finish. So let's add another jump. And we'll call this, to be consistent with the names, we'll call this jump to finish. If shuffle group equals 1, and we'll skip forward to 40. And where do we need to move this one to? It needs to be right after the condition 1 survey, so we'll set this to 20. All right, let's go ahead and test it out. All right, looks like we got assigned to the cat condition. Once again, Cora always gets 100. All right, so that worked. Let's do a couple other runs to make sure that we can be randomly assigned to the other condition. Okay, we got the other condition. So let me just verify that we can continue without answering these questions. Those are optional questions. Okay, and it seems to be working. All right, finally, let's talk about how to deploy your experiment. So you may have noticed right here this publicness setting, and by default it's set to only you can access. So you'll want to keep it there when you're just testing things out and modifying things. There's a couple other settings here, and it looks like a volume control going from least public to most public. This one here, people who have the link can access, that's probably the one that you're most likely to want to use. So if you set it to people who have the link can access, then when it's set there, anyone who has this link here, which is allensexperiment.formr.org, anyone who has that can then go and complete your experiment. And once I set this here, then that link will no longer work. You'll also notice this I am panicking button. You can press this if your experiment is operational and people are able to access it and something is going wrong. This will allow you to just lock it down in case something is really catastrophically going wrong. Couple of pieces of advice, things to do before actually running your experiment is, 1, make sure to clear out old test runs from results before you actually run your experiment for real, or at the very least, make sure you know what the old test runs are and what their timestamps are before you run your experiment for real. Otherwise, you might mistakenly group these old test runs or these old pilot runs with your real data. Because if I were to export this data, it's going to include all these old test runs that I just did, including the incomplete ones, with the data that I collect from a real run. And it might be difficult for me to distinguish between the real data and the test data. So you can do that in the danger zone by deleting results. Of course, you want to be careful with that as well. Only press that when you're absolutely certain you know what you're doing. You might want to export the data first before you do that, just in case you make a mistake. Another thing is to, before you run your experiment, verify that it's collecting the data that you need and want. I pointed out the importance of using meaningful names for your variables. That's because if you're collecting data from a lot of questions, it can be difficult to tell the difference between one or the other. The way the data gets exported, it's just a bunch of columns of named variables, and it can be difficult to process, especially if those names are not very unique and they're not very well named. So very important, before you run your experiment, make sure that you have you're collecting all the data that you think you need. It would be a bad idea to run an experiment and only later realize that you're missing a couple of important variables. Two last pieces of advice. If you are running an experiment and you want to deploy it on an online site like Mechanical Turk or Prolific, this is the GitHub wiki for formr, and it does have information for how to integrate formr with these sorts of sites. So I'll just point you to that for more information. And secondly, there's a pretty useful Google group forum for advice for formr. So if you want to use formr to do more advanced stuff, or you're running into problems, this is often the best place to look first, especially if you find that the documentation page does not answer your question, which is sometimes a little bit limited. All right, so I hope that that's enough to at least get you started with formr. Obviously, there's a lot more that formr can do, but this should be enough to at least get you going.